Commander Zethrak Vaughn had seen a lot of strange things in his 32 years of military service. He had flown through dying stars, talked to beings made of crystal, and once negotiated a peace treaty with a species that communicated entirely through smell. He thought he had seen everything the galaxy had to offer. Then his long-range sensors picked up the humans. The first thing his lieutenant said when the data came through was, "Commander, their ships are made of iron." He said it the way a person says something when they cannot quite believe the words coming out of their own mouth. Iron. Dense, heavy, old-fashioned iron. The Vorkai had stopped using iron in their ships about 4,000 years ago, and here was this new species flying around in what was basically a metal box, acting like they owned the place. That Commander Vaughn watched the human ships for 2 full days before he made any move. Their largest vessel was a warship they had named the USS Cardinal. It was slow. It had no energy shields. Its weapons were weak by Vorkai standards. The engines looked like something from a museum. By every measure the Vorkai had for judging a military force, the humans were far behind. Vaughn felt a little sorry for them, in the honest way that a grown adult feels sorry for a child trying to lift something too heavy. Fleet Admiral Sora gave the order for first contact. This was completely normal. The Vorkai had done it 47 times before with other species. The process was simple. You introduce yourself, you explain that this is hegemony space, you offer the new species a protection deal, and everyone goes home happy. It always worked. It had always worked. Vaughn had no reason to think this time would be any different. He opened the communication channel and found himself looking at a woman with short red hair and the calm, slightly bored expression of someone who had already decided how she felt about this situation before it even started. Her name, according to the ship's registry, was Captain Laura Briggs of the USS Cardinal. She looked at Vaughn the way someone looks at a stranger who has just sat down uninvited at their table. Vaughn introduced himself, gave his rank and fleet designation, and explained that they had entered hegemony space and needed to stop their advance. There was a pause. Captain Briggs glanced at someone off-screen and said, "Did they just tell us to stop?" A voice from somewhere replied, "Yes, ma'am." She looked back at Vaughn and said, unpleasantly but firmly, that they had not known this space was claimed. Vaughn told her it had been claimed for 11,000 years. She said very reasonably that nobody had told them. This was technically true. The Vorkai had boundary beacons everywhere. What they discovered later, after pulling the ship's sensor logs, was that the USS Cardinal had detected those beacons just fine. They had logged them as interesting debris and flown straight through them without slowing down. Vaughn invited Captain Briggs aboard the Vorkai command ship for a formal meeting. She came with 3 people. The first was her chief engineer, a tall and skinny man named Owen Cole, who spent the entire tour staring at every piece of technology he could see with the hungry eyes of a man who very much wanted to take things apart and see how they worked. And he kept asking to touch things. He was told no. He kept almost touching them anyway. The second was her tactical officer, a quiet woman named Diane Park. She did not say much. She carried a small paper notebook and a pen, which the Vorkai crew found old-fashioned and a little charming. What they found less charming was that her eyes never stopped moving. She was watching everything, cataloging everything, remembering everything. She reminded Vaughn of a scout, not a visitor. The third crew member was the ship's doctor. His name was Greg Santos. Within 10 minutes of arriving, he picked up and ate a piece of the decorative plant arrangement in the welcome hall. He chewed it thoughtfully and said it tasted a bit like pepper. One of the Vorkai staff quietly mentioned that it was a ceremonial mourning plant. And Santos asked if it was poisonous to humans. Nobody knew. He shrugged and ate another piece. He was completely fine afterward, which confused the Vorkai medical team for weeks. The meeting went as planned, right up until it did not. Vaughn presented the protection agreement. Briggs read it carefully, all of it, which took a while. Then she put it down and said they would pass. Vaughn stared at her. His lieutenant stared at her. He reminded her, as politely as he could manage, that they were currently surrounded by 12 Vorkai warships and that their own ship was made of iron. Briggs nodded. She said she understood, and that they would prefer to work things out as equals. They were happy to be friendly. They were just not really suited to being administered. Owen Cole, who had been quietly staring at the navigation console the whole time, I said to no one in particular, "Captain, that is a Vorkai Type 9 phase drive. I have read about those. We could really use one of those." Briggs told him to focus. He said he was just saying. They did not give the humans a phase drive. They did eventually work out an agreement of sorts, a vague, non-binding document that satisfied nobody and confused Vorkai legal scholars for the next 2 years. But the important thing, the thing that Vaughn wrote about in his report to the High Council that night, was this. It was the first time in 11,000 years of hegemony history that a first contact species had looked at their protection deal and said, "No, thank you." He did not yet understand that this was the least surprising thing the humans would ever do. Nobody planned for there to be a war. That was the honest truth. What happened was that a Vorkai patrol ship tried to tow away a human freighter that had drifted into a restricted mining corridor, and the freighter's captain, a 43-year-old man from Ohio named Carl Weber, decided that the word impounded was simply not going to work for him that day. Carl Weber had been hauling industrial cargo for 11 years. He had never fired a weapon in his life. He had, however, spent 11 years keeping a very old ship flying by fixing it himself, pushing it harder than it was supposed to go, and trusting the judgment of his crew over any rule book. When the Vorkai patrol vessel locked a tractor beam onto his freighter, Carl did not surrender. He did not ask for help. He pushed his engines to full power. A freighter should not have been able to do that. The physics were all wrong. But Carl's engineer had quietly modified the engine output over several years in ways that violated several safety codes, none of which were Vorkai codes because Carl had never heard of the Vorkai. The tractor beam emitter tore right off the patrol ship. Both vessels spun into the debris field of the mining corridor. The patrol ship suffered damage to its hull and a great deal of damage to its pride. Carl's ship lost 2 cargo containers and a stabilizer that his crew said was already about to fail. When Vorkai forces caught up with Carl 2 days later, he was genuinely sorry about the whole thing and seemed honestly surprised that anyone would call what he had done an act of aggression. He had a delivery to make. He just wanted to get to Callisto Station. This did not start the war, but it set the tone for everything that followed. By the time the Vorkai hegemony formally launched a military intervention, their analysts were feeling confident. The humans had maybe 60 warships. None of them were large. None had energy shielding. None had phase weapons. The top military analyst, a specialist named Preth, filed a report estimating that meaningful resistance would collapse within 14 days. He used words like straightforward and manageable. He presented charts. The charts were very neat. Analyst Preth has since been reassigned to making maps. Commander Vaughn led the first major engagement. He sent the Vorkai cruiser Herath Solam, along with 2 escort destroyers, to intercept the USS Cardinal in contested space. The Herath Solam was 9 times the mass of Briggs's ship. Its weapons had greater range, greater accuracy, and greater power. And the engagement should have been over in 8 minutes. It lasted 6 hours. The humans did not win. That should be said clearly. But they also did not fight like they were supposed to fight, and that turned out to matter enormously. Captain Briggs did not retreat when she saw the cruiser. She did not try to negotiate. She flew her ship directly at the Herath Solam at top speed and opened fire from so close that the Vorkai point defense systems, which were calibrated for normal engagement ranges, briefly did not know what to do. When the shields held against her initial attack, she rammed them. Not to destroy herself, not a last desperate move. She bounced off the forward hull, used the impact to spin her ship around, and came up behind the Harith Solom, where the shields were thinnest. No one in the hegemony had ever tried to close to ramming range on purpose in a space battle. The physics were terrible for the attacker. Every tactical model agreed this was not something a rational commander would do. Captain Briggs was a rational commander. She had simply also decided that the rules of the situation did not apply to her. Owen Cole had spent the past 3 months reinforcing the bow plating of the USS Cardinal with materials he had acquired through methods that no one looked at too closely. The ship survived the collision. It took serious damage, but it survived. The tactical officer on the Harith Solom sent Commander Vaughn a message during the fight that read, "Commander, us they are fighting like they are angry." Vaughn wrote back, "They are angry." The officer replied, "But the tactical situation does not support anger." Vaughn looked at the screen showing Briggs's ship circling them from behind and wrote, "Apparently, they are not aware of that." The Cardinal eventually broke off when her hull integrity dropped too low. The Vorkai had also taken damage, not much, but more than 0, which was more than anyone had expected. A month later, Vorkai forces landed 400 soldiers on a small human colony called Port Denning on one of Jupiter's moons. It had 800 residents. It had no military base. The soldiers expected quick, quiet compliance. Instead, the colonists spent the next 2 days making life extremely difficult using welding tools, mining drones, or processing chemicals, and an industrial excavator driven by a 40-year-old woman named Pam Kowalski, who had been operating heavy machinery since she was a teenager and had no patience for being occupied. Nobody was seriously hurt. Both sides were trying to avoid that. But by the time it ended, the garrison commander had been stunned 3 times by the same person with the same welding torch, 17 soldiers had been trapped in a redirected maintenance tunnel, and Pam Kowalski had driven her excavator through the wall of the temporary Vorkai command post, parked on top of their communications array, climbed out and said, "You people are going to need to leave." The garrison commander's official report included the line, "The population of this settlement does not appear to understand that it has been occupied." He was not wrong. Now, when the colony administrator, a calm man named Ted Greer, was later asked why they resisted, he thought about it for a moment and said, "They didn't ask permission to land. That seemed rude." In the 5th month of the conflict, Commander Vaughn's medical officer came to him looking like she had seen something she could not explain and had been trying to explain it for several days anyway. Her name was Sarith, and she was one of the best doctors in the fleet. She did not usually look unsettled. She looked unsettled now. They had taken a human prisoner during a ground skirmish. He was a young soldier from the USS Cardinal's infantry unit, 26 years old, and his name was Pete Navarro. One of the Vorkai soldiers had hit him with a stun lance during the capture. A stun lance, on a Vorkai adult, it causes about 72 hours of unconsciousness. It is very reliable. The Vorkai had been using stun lances for centuries, and they had never had any surprises. Pete Navarro was unconscious for 9 hours. Then he woke up, asked for something to eat, complained that the meal they gave him tasted like cardboard, and asked if there was anywhere he could go to exercise. Sarith pulled Vaughn aside and told him she had spent 4 days running tests, and that she did not fully understand human biology. She said she had identified roughly 40 features of their physical makeup that should, according to everything she knew about living things, make them weaker than they appeared. Their immune systems worked at a speed and efficiency she had not seen in any other species. Their ability to handle pain was significantly higher than the Vorkai scale could easily measure. Their bodies recovered from injury in ways that felt almost unfair. She showed him the scan she had taken of Pete Navarro. She pointed to several spots on it. The young man had 3 old broken bones that had healed, a repaired shoulder, and evidence of 2 separate surgeries on his left knee. Sarif had asked him about these during the examination. He had said, "Oh, those? Soccer injuries." He seemed faintly surprised she had even noticed them. Vaughn asked what soccer was. Sarif handed him a data sheet. He read it. Soccer was a recreational sport. Billions of humans played it for enjoyment. It involved running hard, making contact with other players, and apparently breaking bones at a rate that qualified as normal and expected. Vaughn put the data sheet down and sat quietly for a while. The supply situation was a different kind of problem entirely. The Vorkai ran their military on precise, carefully maintained supply chains. Every unit in the field had a plan, a schedule, and a backup plan. If you cut off a unit's supply line, that unit had to fall back. This was basic military logic. It had worked for 11,000 years. The Vorkai interdicted the main human supply routes in the 5th month. Their model said this would reduce human combat effectiveness by 60% within 3 weeks. They watched their models fail in front of them, in real time, over the course of those 3 weeks. The humans found other ways. They redesigned their supply network without stopping. They used civilian contractors. They sourced materials from mining operations in sectors the Vorkai had not thought to watch. In 2 confirmed cases, they purchased supplies from Vorkai civilian traders who either did not know a military conflict was happening or did not care because the humans were paying well and in a currency that converted favorably. When this was reported to the Vorkai civilian trade office, the response was that the traders in question were operating in a non-restricted zone and had broken no laws. The Vorkai military had not anticipated that the humans would simply buy things from Vorkai citizens. It seemed obvious in hindsight. It had not been obvious before. The woman running the human supply operation was named Donna Reyes. She had spent her career in civilian shipping logistics before the conflict began. She had never served in a military. In her mind, her job was to get things from one place to another, and the fact that someone was shooting nearby was a background detail, not a reason to stop. She acquired fuel cells once by submitting a civilian resupply request through a relay station that had not yet been updated to reflect the state of the conflict. The request went through. The fuel cells arrived. A Vorkai analyst who reviewed her procurement records later described the experience as reading the work of someone who did not know she was supposed to be losing. Donna Reyes was fully aware there was a conflict. She simply did not consider it her department. The humans also had something that Vorkai military doctrine had never quite accounted for. They called it morale. It referred to how a group of fighters felt, emotionally, and how much those feelings affected what they were able to do. The Vorkai assumed their soldiers would perform because they were trained and ordered to. Emotions were not considered a tactical variable, but the humans fought harder when things were going badly. This was documented. It was not a guess. Multiple observers noted that human units under pressure, outgunned and low on supplies, would perform at levels above their own previous records. One behavioral analyst named Tharvin wrote in his report that the human combat response to adversity appeared to involve increased aggression and faster creative thinking, and that he had reviewed the data many times and could not fit it into any model he had, and that his working theory was that humans became angry and then used the anger productively, which was not supposed to be possible, but seemed to be happening anyway. He added a footnote. The crew of the USS Cardinal had started playing loud music over their internal communication system during combat. Vorkai signals intelligence intercepted the audio. Several analysts described it as energetic and disorganized. They also noted quietly in separate reports that they kept catching themselves listening to it. Lieutenant Commander Draxus asked Vaughn if they could find out who the artist was. Vaughn told him to focus on the war. Draxus wrote the question down anyway. Relay Station Kovath was not a military target. Everyone agreed on this. It was a communications hub. It relayed signals. It had a small crew. It had no weapons, no garrison, no strategic value beyond the fact that a significant portion of Vorkai communications in the contested sector passed through its systems. Capturing it was supposed to be quick and painless, a simple errand on the way to bigger objectives. The station was staffed by 11 humans and one very large dog named Biscuit. The dog was a tan-colored Labrador retriever and had apparently lived on the station for 3 years. How a dog had come to be a permanent resident of an interstellar relay station was a question that nobody in the Vorkai command structure ever fully answered. Biscuit seemed very comfortable there. He had a bed near the control room and a basket of soft toys. The station commander was a man named Roy Delgado. He had worked in communications technology for 19 years. He was not a soldier. He was not trained in tactics or resistance or negotiation under pressure. He was a technician who was very good at keeping systems running and very calm when things went wrong, because things went wrong fairly often in deep space, and if you panicked every time, the job would destroy you. Captain Sethos Van led the boarding party. 20 Vorkai soldiers, full equipment, trained and ready. He had done this kind of operation before. He expected to find 11 frightened technicians who would step aside quietly and let the Vorkai take control of the station. He had the boarding ship docked and the corridor secured within 4 minutes. It was going well. What he did not know was that Roy Delgado had spent the 40 minutes between detecting the incoming Vorkai ships and their docking doing something very specific. But he had reconfigured the station's relay system so that all Vorkai military communications being routed through Kovath now passed through a secondary pathway that ran directly through the station's main control interface, the interface that Roy was currently sitting at. Van entered the control room with his soldiers behind him and told the humans they were prisoners. Roy Delgado looked up from his console, looked at the soldiers, and said he would like to discuss terms. Van said they were not in a position to negotiate. Roy said very politely that the 12 Vorkai resupply ships currently waiting on a routing confirmation before they could proceed to the forward bases might see things differently. He could hold that confirmation for as long as necessary, or they could talk. Van contacted Commander Vaughn. Vaughn contacted Fleet Admiral Sora. Sora contacted the Logistics Division. The Logistics Division confirmed that yes, there were 12 resupply vessels sitting idle, and yes, the routing confirmation was currently in the hands of a communications technician named Roy Delgado, who had apparently just invented hostage negotiation using signal traffic. The negotiation lasted just under an hour. Roy did not ask for a lot. He wanted safe passage for his crew. He wanted the station to remain operational under joint management. He wanted formal acknowledgement that his people had not been combatants. And he wanted food. Specifically, he wanted his supply stores restocked, because they had been running low before the Vorkai arrived, and his crew was getting tired of the options their onboard systems could produce. And he mentioned proper coffee twice. The Vorkai agreed to all of it. They had no real choice. Van filed his report that evening. It was 3 pages long. The summary read, "The station was secured. The conditions of securing it were set by a middle-aged technician who showed no hostility and whose primary concern throughout appeared to be the welfare of his crew and the quality of their beverages." Throughout the negotiation, Biscuit had wandered into the room, walked past the armed Vorkai soldiers, and sat down on the foot of Captain Van. Van did not move him. He later explained in writing that it had seemed impolite. When the supply ship arrived with the items Roy had requested, 3 members of the Vorkai crew were later seen giving Biscuit treats from the package labeled with his name. None of them were ordered to do this. None of them mentioned doing it afterward. It happened anyway. It was around this time that Earth sent an official diplomat. Her name was Ambassador Helen Vo. She was 51 years old, had spent decades negotiating trade deals across difficult situations, and arrived on a ship that was, like all human ships, made of iron. She had an aide named Sam Okafor, who was young and quiet and seemed to absorb information the way a sponge absorbs water. The meeting with Fleet Admiral Sora started formally. Sora laid out the hegemony's position. Humans had entered sovereign space without authorization, had caused disruption to trade and transit routes, and had engaged in hostile action against hegemony forces. A resolution was available. It would involve formal acknowledgement of hegemony authority in the contested sector. The Ambassador Vo listened to everything. She nodded at the right moments. When Sora finished, Vo said she had a question. She asked if it was true that a Vorkai analyst had described one of their supply coordinators as the most dangerous logistician in the contested sector. Sora said that was classified. Vo said she knew, and that they had obtained it anyway. She asked a second question. Was it also true that the Vorkai behavioral analysis team had recommended ending all boarding operations against human-crewed stations after the Kovath incident? Sora said that was also classified. Vo said that was also yes. Vo folded her hands on the table and said she thought they should talk honestly. She said they both knew the military situation was not as clean as the hegemony had expected, despite all the advantages. She said they both knew that the humans knew this, so perhaps they could have a conversation between people who both wanted this to end without anyone writing any more embarrassing reports. There was a long silence. Then Fleet Admiral Sora, one of the most decorated officers in 30 years of Vorkai military history, laughed. It was brief. She covered it quickly. But it happened. Vaughn, who was present, wrote it down in his personal notes because he was not sure anyone would believe him otherwise. Sora looked at Vo and said, "You people are a complete catastrophe." Ambassador Vo smiled and said warmly, "We have been told." The agreement that ended the conflict was not the agreement the Vorkai had planned. It was not close to the one they had planned. Their legal team reviewed the final document for 3 days before sending Commander Vaughn a message that said simply, "This appears to have been written by humans." They meant it as a criticism of its structure. Vaughn read it as an accurate observation. The Kovath Accord, as it came to be called, set out a number of things. The two sides would recognize each other's territorial boundaries. Those boundaries would be properly surveyed and mapped over the following year, with representatives from both sides present. A trade framework was established between the hegemony and the humans, and it was built on equal standing between the two parties. A non-aggression clause bound both sides going forward. A new joint communications protocol would prevent ships from wandering into the wrong territory without knowing it, which was, if everyone was being honest, where the whole thing had started. There was no protection agreement. The humans remained without hegemony oversight or administrative authority, which Ambassador Vo noted was simply how they preferred to live. Fleet Admiral Sora signed the document. Vo signed it. Sam Okafor produced a small physical stamp from his bag and used it to notarize the accord. Sora picked up the stamp and turned it over in her hands and asked about it. Okafor said it was an old habit. Sora handed it back and looked at it for another moment before letting go. Commander Vaughn was asked by 3 members of the High Council to include a personal assessment of the humans alongside the formal report. He agreed to do so, with the note that his assessment was based on 6 months of observation and might still be incomplete. And he wrote it carefully because he wanted to get it right. The first thing he wrote about was their bodies. Humans were physically resilient in a way that seemed wrong the first time you saw it. Their medical officer, Sareth, had spent weeks studying Pete Navarro's biology after he recovered from the stun lance in 9 hours and asked for food. She had identified more than 40 things about human physiology that should have made them more fragile than they were. Their bodies repaired damage at a speed that did not match what their biology looked like on paper. They tolerated pain that would slow or stop most other known species. They went back to work, went back to fighting, went back to running and lifting and doing hard things in a way that their physical frames did not seem built to support, and yet they did it anyway, and their frames held. The second thing he wrote about was how they made decisions. Human commanders did not always recognize where the edges of a plan were supposed to be. Carl Weber did not know a freighter could not tear a tractor beam loose from a warship, so he tried it. Captain Briggs did not know a warship should not charge a cruiser 9 times its size and try to get behind its shields, so she tried it. Roy Delgado did not know a communications technician should not be able to negotiate with a boarding party of 20 armed soldiers, so he tried it. In each case, the thing that should not have worked did work, either completely or at least well enough. Vaughn spent a long time trying to figure out if this was strategy or simply a refusal to accept the limits of a situation. He eventually decided it was both, and that for humans, those two things were the same. The third thing he wrote about was their stubbornness. Not the aggressive kind of stubbornness, though they had that too. He meant a quieter kind. A kind that showed up in Donna Reyes finding fuel cells in a war zone by filing paperwork, in the colonists of Port Denning refusing to feel occupied, in Pete Navarro waking up from a stun lance and asking to exercise. There was something in humans that simply did not accept the story that the situation was telling them. When things were bad, they seemed to decide almost automatically that the situation was wrong and they were right, and then they acted on that decision. It should not have worked as often as it did. It worked more often than it had any reason to. The fourth thing he wrote about was their curiosity. That Captain Briggs had asked him 7 personal questions within 15 minutes of their first meeting. 3 of them were about his family. Vorkai officers did not ask about families in professional settings. It was not appropriate. But Briggs had asked, and she had listened to the answers, and she had seemed genuinely interested. Not as a tactic, not to gather information, just because she wanted to know. He had seen this in many of the humans he encountered. They were interested in things, in people, in how things worked, what other people ate, what other species found funny, what they believed about the universe. Owen Cole had asked more questions about Vorkai engineering in 2 days than most hegemony students asked in a year of formal training. Greg Santos had eaten a morning plant and then asked, with real curiosity, whether it was culturally important. Vaughn wrote that he had found this quality uncomfortable at first, and then, slowly, something close to refreshing. He wrote about Owen Cole specifically. After the accord was signed, and as a gesture of goodwill, the Vorkai had offered Cole access to a decommissioned Type 6 phase drive from a ship they were scrapping. Not the Type 9 he had wanted. They were not that generous. Cole spent 14 hours with it. He sent Vaughn a message that said he thought he understood how it worked but had some questions. The questions took 3 more days to answer in full. He also included, at the end, several suggestions for modifications that he thought might improve the drive's efficiency. Vorkai engineers reviewed the suggestions in private. They implemented 2 of them, and they told Vaughn not to mention this to anyone. Vaughn included it in the report anyway, because he was filing an accurate document and it belonged there. Near the end of his assessment, Vaughn wrote about Biscuit. He had not planned to include the dog, but Sareth had written a paragraph about canine biology in her final medical notes, and Vaughn felt the point was important enough to pass along. She had written that the relationship between humans and their companion animals revealed something significant about how humans related to the world around them. Humans extended care and loyalty not just to other humans, but outward, to creatures that were entirely different from them. Creatures that could not communicate in any complex way, that offered nothing in return except presence and warmth. She wrote that she believed the Vorkai had underestimated how central this trait was to every interaction they had with the humans. Vaughn believed she was right. He ended his report with something he did not usually include in official documents. He wrote that he had arrived in the Sol system, expecting to find a primitive species that would need to be managed carefully and guided into compliance with galactic order. He had found instead a species that was loud, stubborn, physically improbable, emotionally unpredictable, and deeply, relentlessly interested in every living thing they encountered. He had found a species that did not know what they were supposed to be limited by, and that this ignorance, more than their iron ships or their recovered bones or their impossible supply chains, was probably the most important thing about them. And the galaxy, in his experience, had been shaped most by those who did not know they were supposed to stop. He submitted the report complete and requested a long period of rest leave. The request was approved. Before he left his command ship, he stopped by the supply bay, where the last crate from the Kovath resupply was still waiting to be logged. He looked at the small package with Biscuit's name written on it in human lettering. He stood there for a moment. Then he picked up one of the treats, turned it over in his hand, and set it back down carefully. He went home. He had a lot to think about.